from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Michael McKee here in New York on a possible staged reduction in Chinese tariffs. David Powell from London on continued concerns over European growth. And from Washington, Bill Ferries on new developments in the impeachment inquiry. In the meantime, I understand that there is a redhead coming across the terminal right now, Mike. It's just for you. The United States says the first China trade deal would include tariff rollback. That seems like a bit of a confirmation on what we heard out of China overnight.
We did hear from the Ministry of Commerce in China overnight that if there was an agreement, and they emphasize the word if, that there would be a rollback of tariffs. Now, we don't know, and I don't know whether the Bloomberg story here gives us any more details, what they're referring to, which tariffs they're referring to. Will they be rolled back? There were the tariffs that the administration put on about $112 billion worth of Chinese goods September 1st. There were the October 15th tariff increase that the president canceled already, and there's another round of increases expected to go in on December 15th. Are those going to be canceled? Still a lot at play here.
It seems like every day there's some tantalizing tidbit that comes out of Beijing or out of Washington, but we still don't know exactly what have they agreed to, what haven't they agreed to, what tariffs are included, and when does it all happen?
Which always makes me smile when we see the markets go up on these headlines, because you remember back in June, the two presidents at the G20 meeting came out and said, well, trade war is on hold. Things are going to move forward. We're going to make a deal. And then nothing happened, and the president imposed more tariffs. So anything is possible at this point. But it does seem, particularly since the Chinese are talking about it, that there is some sort of agreement. Now, the devil will be in the details, and we don't know from what we've heard so far that there's any particular gain for either side in this. But if they just don't make things worth, that might be considered a win.
But if this plays out the way it seems to be pointing at the moment, it does feel like the Chinese kind of got their way a bit, because they were always saying, we're not going to do a deal unless we get some of these tariffs rolled back. And President Trump said, we're not going to roll back the tariffs till we get an overall deal. This sounds like maybe we'll roll back some of the tariffs. As you say, we don't know which ones, even short of a total overall conclusion of the deal.
Well, this deal is structured around the idea that China gives something, that China buys U.S. goods, that China changes its intellectual property laws, that China agrees to a currency monitoring regime. The U.S. wasn't going to do anything, and so to give the Chinese cover to do this, that may have been what happened. A number of more pragmatic Chinese negotiators in the White House, like Robert Lighthizer, didn't want those September 1st tariffs. So they probably, they could have been able to convince the president, get rid of those. We didn't need them in the first place. It's a sign to the Chinese, and this will enable us to move forward. Okay, great reporting from Mike McKee on a story that is developing even as we speak. That's U.S.-China trade negotiations. Meanwhile, the European Commission is cutting its growth forecast for the European area, partly because of trade uncertainty. Let's bring in now Bloomberg's David Powell. He's over in London. So this is not very happy news for Europe, David.
Exactly. The European Commission has downgraded its outlook for growth for this year and for next year, and that is a reflection of this slowdown in manufacturing around the world that has been induced by the trade war started by the United States and the uncertainty that has caused.
Well, that's the question. They're saying a lot of it is because of the trade war. Is that right, or are there also underlying challenges, structural challenges in Europe?
Well, Europe has plenty of structural challenges, but so do a lot of other places in the world. What accounts for the slowdown we've seen this year, though, is primarily that trade war. In Bloomberg Economics, we've created a gauge of uncertainty that looks at financial market variables and surveys and mentions of uncertainty in the press. And you can see that it's been very elevated this year, and it's had a negative impact on the economy. The good news is that that's starting to come down. So essentially, people are starting to think that ahead of the presidential election that we have coming up in the United States, the U.S. will de-escalate this trade war, that the United States will decide not to impose tariffs on European autos, and that will reduce uncertainty and provide a bit of a boost for the European economy next year.
Okay, David, thank you so much for joining us. That's David Powell reporting from London. And now let's turn to Bloomberg's Bill Ferries in Washington, D.C., because we're getting now more information on what happened behind those closed doors, and some of the transcripts are indicating maybe it's a bit of a bigger issue the President Trump is facing in this impeachment inquiry than we thought.
Right. There's been a lot of focus, David, on this idea of a quid pro quo by Ukraine and the U.S. For Ukraine to get military aid and for the U.S., the Trump administration to get an investigation into Joe Biden and his son and some background on what happened during the 2016 election. What the transcripts we've seen this week have shown, however, is that there was also a very different deal in mind, and that really centered around an Oval Office meeting between the new Ukrainian President Zelensky and President Trump. It was something the Ukrainians wanted very badly, and the U.S. officials clearly realized that. And the transcripts this week are really laying that out in a little bit more detail. We have a text message from Paul Volcker, Kurt Volker, the envoy to Ukraine, basically saying Ukraine needs to convince President Trump that they're willing to look into what happened in 2016 and the Bidens in order to get that meeting. And that really followed up on a public tweet from Rudy Giuliani in June, where he was criticizing the Ukrainian government for not having already started an investigation into the Bidens. So this kind of adds an interesting detail to the focus on whether there really was a quid pro quo, and it's something we expect the impeachment inquiry to dig further into, particularly as we head into public hearings next week.
Well, that's just what I was going to ask you about, Bill, because this is the transcripts of things that happen behind closed doors, as I said. But next week, I guess before Judiciary Committee, we're actually going to have some public hearings. What do we expect? What's important there?
Well, one of the leadoff witnesses will be William Taylor. He was the ambassador, the temporary ambassador to the Ukraine, who was handpicked by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in May after the U.S. recalled the previous ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch. He has earned a reputation as a detailed note taker. It's his testimony that's really helped fill in a lot of the gaps in terms of the timing of various discussions, what was going on between the official channel led by the State Department and some of Mike Pompeo's envoys, and this unofficial channel led by President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Those two channels were often working at cross purposes, it seemed, to each other. And Bill Taylor was often Ambassador Bill Taylor was often at the center of those two parallel tracks.
Okay, many thanks to Bloomberg's Bill Ferry. Let's get a check on how the markets are reading on today's top stories. And joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So I see actually there was a spike with this news about possible rollback, although it's come down some.
It's come down a little bit. We're a little bit off the highs, but no doubt these trade headlines and the idea that both now the U.S. and China are saying that there is likely to be some sort of phase one deal that will include rollbacks. Stocks overall on the day reacting very well. But we also have a couple key earnings reports here that are doing well also because of this trade news. But Qualcomm, the chip maker, they put up a better than expected quarter. They also raised the outlook. A lot of that having to do with 5G. And then Baidu, those shares are absolutely soaring. That's basically the Google of China, if you will. They did very well. The stock up more than 10%. Investors, analysts are saying that they could really be poised to go straight ahead. So here in the U.S., the influence is the fact that Alphabet is the top stock for the communication services sector and one of the top sectors. So both of those stocks getting the trade lift because apparently Baidu is also saying that they have not seen a big economic slowdown because of the trade war. But you put that together with these strong quarters, and we have a nice tailwind for stocks on the day.
Right, just
highs.
what we wanted. Okay,
yes.
Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Thanks very much for the report. We turn now to Vivian Hurtado for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, we begin with that news that broke at the top of your show, or I should say the UK Labour Party equality spokeswoman wants to become its deputy leader. Don Butler's declaration coming after the current deputy Tom Watson announced he'll step down. This on the day of the upcoming election campaign. Butler speaking exclusively with Bloomberg in London.
I thought very carefully about who should replace Tom, and after giving it some thought, I will be throwing my hat in the ring. I've got a track record of being very supportive to our leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and ensuring that the Labour Party is on the front foot.
Watson's pending departure is seen as a major blow to the party at the start of campaigning. Butler's emergence is a sign of how much power has shifted firmly to Labour's socialist wing. And France's President Emmanuel Macron warning President Donald Trump's neglect of U.S. allies is killing NATO. Macron telling The Economist that's causing an existential threat for America's transatlantic partners. Last month, he was infuriated President Trump withdrew U.S. troops from Syria, this without first consulting NATO members. And over to Burkina Faso, gunmen there ambushing a convoy. It was transporting workers of Canadian gold producer Semafo. At least 38 people were killed in the assault. To date, it's the deadliest Islamist militant attack there, and it comes when prices are rallying and gold producers are pouring money into the region. Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Viviana Hurtado. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thanks so much, Viviana. Coming up, good news may be coming on the trade front. But do Democrats really want a deal with China? We ask our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
We've had a lot of problems with losing jobs, but the principal reason has been bad trade policy.
You got trade agreements like NAFTA and PNTR with China done, which have cost us 4 million jobs.
You start having trade deals.
Trade deals.
Trade deals. His trade war is a failure. Not like this thing that the president's trying to push through Congress right now.
A bunch of corporations, giant multinational corporations, who've been calling the shots on trade, giant multinational corporations that have no loyalty to America.
So it turns out it's not just President Trump who thinks we need to get tougher on trade. Several Democrats, as you just heard, running for president talk a pretty tough game as well. So is there really that big a difference between Republicans and Democrats on trade at this point? Welcome now, Sarah Chamberlain, President and CEO of Republican Main Street Partnership, coming to us today from Washington, and here in New York, Matt Bennett. He is the co-founder of the Third Way. So Matt, let me pick on the Democrat first. I mean, that sounds like basically the Democrats sort of agree with what President Trump is doing. Maybe not how he's going about it, but certainly what he's trying to do.
Well, that's not really a change. Democrats always run for president as protectionists, and they always govern as president as free traders. You saw that with Bill Clinton. You saw that with Obama. You saw that with Hillary Clinton when she turned 180 degrees on TPP and said that she was against it when she'd been for it before. What is a change is that we have a Republican protectionist as president. That didn't exist in nature before, and so that's what's really upended the politics of this.
So Sarah, President Trump has been no secret of the fact that he's pretty hostile to some of the things that have been done on trade. It worked well with his base the last time around. If he comes up in an agreement with China, will that redound to his benefit, or will people think he's getting soft?
No, I think it would absolutely be his benefit, especially in the suburban areas. I would love to see a deal here so we can move on into election year and have this behind us.
Well, let me pick up on exactly what you said, and that is suburban areas, because we had an election on Tuesday, as you know well, Sarah, and there were some people who came on, Republicans who came on and said, we're a little worried about some suburbs. For example, around Philadelphia, if you look at some of the things that happened even in Kentucky, that maybe there's a little weakness for President Trump and the Republican Party in the suburbs. Are you concerned about that?
Absolutely. I think actually I was more extreme. I think the suburbs are on fire. We need to address the concerns of the suburban, especially women like I am, and start talking to them. But we just are not doing that as a Republican Party. You talked about the suburbs of Philadelphia. Delaware County, for the first time, is all Democratic. Civil War. It goes back to the Civil War since they had. I mean, this is crazy. We need to address these. And I think going back to the China deal, if we can get a China deal, that certainly helps. And we need USMCA. We have to get Nancy Pelosi to drive that forward.
So, Matt, how much of that issue in the suburbs is more social issues rather than economic issues? And to turn it back to the Democrats, I keep asking, who is the Trump voting Republican last time around who will switch their vote based on the economy, given where we are in the economy, got really low unemployment, really low inflation?
The problem is not unemployment. People can get a job. The problem is that the jobs don't pay enough to support a middle-class life for a lot of people, particularly in bigger metro areas. 67% of people who work full-time do not have kind of a middle-class life based on what they earn and what their benefits are. So I think the biggest economic problem isn't unemployment. It's this feeling that they're running in place and that there isn't real opportunity to get ahead. I think trade deals will have a relatively marginal impact in the suburbs. They're very important in areas like Iowa and in rural Wisconsin, where farmers are acutely aware of what's going on with trade. I think suburban voters are kind of less tuned into that.
So, Sarah, this was going to be, I think, a fascinating election anyway, but now we have this little thing called an impeachment inquiry that's going to go public next week. How does it factor in? I know when I talk to Democrats in the House of Representatives, they say this is not a political issue, this is a matter of the Constitution, but it will have political effects potentially.
It certainly will have political effects, but right now we're just pleased it's coming out into the open. And what I'm finding as I travel the country talking to suburban women, they're kind of paying attention, but they're really paying much more attention to their needs as health care, the needs of education, and frankly, an equal pay amendment. Those are what they're focusing on, and impeachment is kind of a side story for them.
But what does the Republican Party have to say to those people? More importantly, pointedly, what does President Donald Trump say to those women?
He's not handling that well right now. So we're hoping that he can continue to fire up his base, which he's doing, and then pivot and start talking about health care, prescription drug costs, hospital transparency, and start feeding the suburban women what they need. Because as we talked about Tuesday night, we are on fire in suburban districts, and we have got to understand this in order to try to get the House back and to hold the Senate.
So, Matt, the Democratic Party may have been on fire, but they certainly are divided about health care, which Sarah just referred to. Yeah. I mean, you're in danger, I think, in the Democratic Party of turning it from an advantage to a disadvantage. It was voters were afraid of Donald Trump and their health care. Now they're afraid that Elizabeth Warren's going to take away their insurance policy.
That's exactly right. We're about to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Right now, people are angry about how the Republicans and Trump in particular have managed health care. They've kind of taken shots at the Affordable Care Act, prescription drug prices, nothing has happened. But it is very dangerous for Democrats to be talking about Medicare for all, and that is why we have been pushing very hard to get Warren and others to back off of that. It is absolute political poison.
So Sarah, there's some division among the Democrats about their plan. I'm not sure what President Trump's plan even is. Is there a plan that he's running on in 2020 for health care?
Not that he's talking about, but our members certainly are talking about it. First of all, Elizabeth Warren, I think, is trying to bankrupt the country. What we're trying to do as we talk about health care is, as I said, lower prescription drugs, do transparency, start to give choices to the American people on how they pay for their prescription drugs. Can they get, do they always have to go to the pharmacy? Can they do mail-ins? I mean, there's a lot of things we're looking at kind of around the edges, why Elizabeth Warren focuses on bankrupting us. Because you know what? People didn't like ACA. They're certainly not going to like the government totally taking over the health care.
Okay, many thanks to our political panel of Matt Bennett here in New York and Sarah Chamberlain down in Washington. Still ahead, a Saudi spy plot. It turns out that 2 Twitter employees may have been using the service to spy on users for the Saudi Arabian government. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Trouble for Twitter. 2 former employees of the company and a Saudi national were charged by the U.S. with helping the government in Riyadh spy on dissidents who use the social network. For more, let's bring in now Bloomberg Technology's Kurt Wagner in San Francisco. So, Kurt, I certainly was struck by this one across yesterday afternoon. What is it exactly they say that these individuals did?
Yeah, the claims here are that these former employees of Twitter basically used their access inside the company to look up the, personal information or the records or the accounts of people who might not be, or people who were critical of the Saudi royal family. And so they used their ability as employees to kind of pull private information that would not have otherwise been accessible to someone from the outside. As you probably know, Twitter does allow people to be anonymous on their service, so oftentimes you don't know who's actually running an account, but an employee might be able to pull an email, a name, a phone number, and therefore tie an identity of an account to an actual person. So,
Kurt, usually when we think about spying or espionage, we think it's espionage against a government, not against individuals. Is this basically an espionage claim? I understand it was on behalf, allegedly, of the Saudi Arabian government, but it wasn't of the U.S. government.
No, but that is kind of what the claim is here, because these are what the DOJ is saying are foreign influence actors, right? So they are being paid by a foreign government or rewarded by a foreign government for using their position here. One of the employees did work in the San Francisco office for Twitter, and so this is kind of the idea, is that they were spies essentially for the Saudi royal family.
So, Kurt, what's Twitter saying? And specifically, do they have any safeguards in place to make sure their employees that have access to this can't get it for the wrong reason?
So Twitter came out and they thanked the DOJ, they thanked the U.S. government. They kind of had a pretty boilerplate statement, but they did say in the statement that, one of the things they try to do is limit what employees can access internally. They did not share specifics around which employees are able to access which data. You may remember a few years ago, right before an employee quit, I believe he temporarily suspended the President Donald Trump's Twitter account, and that raised some questions around what kind of access employees inside of these tech companies might have to individual user accounts. And so we've seen both at Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube, we've seen these platforms really try to play up the idea that a lot of this information is locked down, but clearly we see issues where it keeps coming up.
Okay, Kurt, thank you so much for the reporting from San Francisco. That's Kurt Wagner of Bloomberg Intelligence. And now let's stick on Twitter for our stock of the hour. The shares are lower today a bit, but it's not necessarily about those Saudi spying allegations. Katie Lyons is here to tell us what's going on with that stock. You can see it bouncing back down and then back up again.
Yeah, it started the day much lower than it is now. Now we have to say we do have a broader rally in the market happening. Nonetheless, it is still down. And I would start by saying these allegations don't do Twitter any favors here. I mean, the last thing you want if you're a big tech social media company is to have your name in the headlines for a reason such as this as it relates to user data privacy. It's just not something that you want to see, especially with all the ire you've already drawn from Capitol Hill on those issues. So put that aside. Then we look at the fundamentals. Twitter actually also got a downgrade today over at Evercore. The analyst Kevin Rippey over there downgraded to underperform. He said he just was too optimistic on what Twitter's long-term profit growth could actually look like. He says that they have been benefiting from the fact that they haven't been investing that much in things like R&D. And when you think back to Twitter's most recent quarter, they reported revenue on advertising really missed the bar, and they blamed a bug for it. And he says that stems from, underdeveloping these things. He says when you do have to spend more on R&D, that's eventually going to cripple their profit, and they just don't think revenue is going to keep pace with the kind of spending that takes.
And as you suggest, Katie, that's part of a longer story with Twitter. They're not growing users as fast, but they say we're going to get more money for the users we have. And the question is, can they monetize those users?
Well, it's a very good question. And actually, they did in the surprise. The last quarter they reported surprised in two ways. User growth actually was strong. It was the advertising revenue that really surprised to the downside. And of course, this reminds me with Twitter in the conversations we've been having about it in recent weeks as it relates to political advertising. Yes, it's not that big of a financial part of the equation, about $3 million in last midterm cycle. But nonetheless, they're removing those political ads. That also takes down revenue. So if there's any question about the existing revenue they will have on the platform, that's not a great sign for Twitter.
Bumpy road for Twitter. Thank you so much to Katie Lyons. And now up next, help may or may not be on the way for U.S. manufacturers hit by tariffs with China. What could that mean for the state of Delaware? We talk with Democratic Senator Tom Carper. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Viviana Hurtado.
David, we begin with that story you broke at the top of the show. The U.S. confirming phase one of its trade deal with China would include a rollback on tariffs. Beijing already said the two countries agreed to a phased rollback of tariffs on each other's goods. Those duties now apply to the majority of Chinese exports to the U.S. Lawyers for John Bolton say the ex-national security advisor won't go before U.S. House impeachment committees without a court order. Bloomberg has learned Democrats are unwilling to litigate this issue. Why? Because it would take too long. Today on Capitol Hill, as part of the probe, Vice President Pence's special advisor for Europe giving closed-door testimony. And Iran saying last week it blocked a UN inspector from a nuclear site because she tested positive for suspected traces of explosives. The allegation coming as Iran ramps up its uranium enrichment program. The International Atomic Energy Agency says Iran is acting unlawfully. The UN nuclear watchdog calling the Islamic Republic's actions a provocation.
The IAEA has detected evidence of potential undeclared nuclear material in Iran. Iran has no plausible explanation for the detected material and must explain where it came from and where it is now. Iran's detention of this inspector was without question an outrageous and unwarranted act of intimidation.
Iran denies detaining the inspector and says she was removed without force. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel says a large boost in her country's defense spending is, quote, realistic but ambitious. By the year 2031, Germany's defense ministry wants the defense budget to equal 2% of its GDP. In the past, the U.S. has criticized Berlin's defense spending. It's gone up, but it's still below 1.4% of GDP. Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Viviana Hurtado. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thanks so much, Viviana. Trade war rollback. The United States and China have agreed to lift some tariffs on each other if the two countries reach a phase one deal. The U.S. confirmed the initial report that had come out of China's Ministry of Commerce, and that Ministry of Commerce had said that negotiators had constructive talks and the tariffs would be removed in phases as progress is made. Our next guest represents a state where manufacturers are feeling the pinch from those tariffs, and he's working for bipartisan legislation that would give Congress more power to curtail the president's use of tariffs. We welcome now Senator Tom Carper. He's Democrat of Delaware, back to Bloomberg. He joins us from Capitol Hill. So, Senator, thank you so much for being here.
David, thanks so much.
Have you heard anything about this possible rollback in a phase one deal?
I have not. When listening to you talking about this rollback, possible rollback, I'm a recovering governor. Every week I visit businesses large and small in Delaware. I always ask, what can we do to help you? And among the things they always say is provide some certainty and predictability. So if we can get some certainty and predictability on this front, that's a good thing. Having said that, we should have never pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the first place. We were part of a 12-nation trading deal, as you know. We were leading it. China was on the outside because of their bad behavior. That's why we should have stayed. We should have never gotten out of it, and why this administration pulled us out in order to play this game of tariff wars. It's just crazy. It's just foolish.
Give us a sense of how it is affecting your constituents in Delaware. I've seen some accounts of you sitting down and meeting with manufacturing companies and getting it firsthand from them how it's affecting them. Give us a sense of what it's doing to Delaware.
Yeah, well, I recall one conversation with one particular manufacturer said, tell us what the rules are going to be, give us some flexibility, and leave us alone. And as it turns out, we aren't doing that. We're not telling what the rules are going to be. It's not clear if they're going to have these tariffs, if they're going to be on or off. They need certain predictability. And this administration, if we're going to make a deal with China, hopefully a good deal, having screwed up on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, let's make it. Let's make it and stop just messing around and just screwing with people.
So let's turn now, we're talking with Senator Tom Carper of Delaware. Let's turn now to the subject of health care, very much on the national agenda, certainly in the 2020 election as we've listened to the Democratic debates. There's this apparent division within the Democratic Party about Medicare for all on the one hand, as opposed to an enhanced form of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I talked to Nancy Pelosi on Friday, and she quite specifically said she was not a fan of health care for all. This is part of what she had to say, Senator.
I'm not a big fan of Medicare for all. I mean, I welcome the debate. I think that we should have health care for all. I think that the Affordable Care benefit is better than the Medicare benefit.
So Senator Carper, where are you on Medicare for all? Where are the people of Delaware?
Well, I was one who helped write parts of the Affordable Care Act. I think it's good, and rather than spending the last several years trying to destroy it, if we'd been spending that time trying to make it better in a bipartisan way, we'd be better off than people in this country would be a lot better off. The idea of the exchanges is actually originally a Republican idea. It's a good idea, and instead of trying to kill it, why do we make it work? We're seeing prices in the exchanges, for premiums in the exchanges, leveling off in the current year. In the year to come, I think in like 30 or some states, the premiums are coming down. In Delaware and about 6 other states, premiums in the exchanges are coming down by double-digit rates. And so rather than killing it, we ought to figure out how to make it work. And we're beginning to see insurers coming back into the exchanges, more competition that'll help bring down prices even further. So that's how I feel about it. The idea of Medicare for all, what we agree on as Democrats, we agree on this. Access to affordable health care for everybody. That's like the principle we agree on. The policies, we have disagreement, and we have an honest disagreement. And what we need to do is work that out. And I'm not sure how you pay for Medicare for all. I think Elizabeth Warren has indicated how she would pay for it. But we have a situation right now where we got half of our people in this country get health care from their employers, a quarter get their health care from Medicaid, about 15% get their coverage from Medicare, and the rest are looking for coverage in places like the exchanges. exchanges. That's not a bad system, and if we want to do like a single payer, add that to the mix, I think that makes sense as well. But right now, we're running out of money in Medicare, running out of money. And we're going to run out of money altogether in the next decade. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. And we have a huge budget deficit. It's $850 billion last year. Looking at $1 trillion this next year. We have to be mindful of the cost. And what we're finally showing in the exchange is a good idea that if you actually let it work, it'll work and it'll provide care to the people who need it. And it's affordable, increasingly affordable.
We're speaking with Senator Tom Carper, Democrat of Delaware. Let's talk about that 2020 election just for a minute. As I understand, you've endorsed former Vice President Joe Biden. Are you concerned that he's not making the headway that some would have liked, particularly in Iowa right now? The most recent polls show him fourth or even worse.
I think the polling that I've looked at, the national polling and the state-by-state polling, indicates that in the states that we worry most about, the battleground states, where include Wisconsin and Michigan, Minnesota, others, Pennsylvania, Joe Biden does very well. And my hope is in the end, I was just out in Iowa about a month ago with my wife. We were received very warmly. There's a lot of people who like him, and we were in the western part of the state. And but he's trying to be everywhere, and you can't be in every single state. And he's been there so many times over the years, and my hope is he'll do well there. I think we need somebody who can not just unite our party. We need that. We need somebody who can beat Trump. We need somebody who can unite our country. Somebody who can restore standing in the world to the rest of the world. I just think Joe Biden does all those things very well. Maybe, I think, better than any of the other candidates. And I know a bunch of them pretty well and think well of them.
Senator, I want to close on a subject you and I have talked about before. I want to come back to infrastructure, because there was a time when President Trump was talking about it a lot, the leadership on the Hill were talking about it a lot, and now I don't hear anything about it at all. Where are we on infrastructure? How did it get sort of dropped off the side of the table?
The transportation infrastructure for roads, highways, bridges in the Senate belongs in the jurisdiction of not one, not two, not three, but 4 committees. The committee that John Barrasso of Wyoming and I lead, the Environment and Public Works Committee, focuses on surface transportation. We have passed unanimously a reauthorization bill, $287 billion over the next 5 years. Our bill is out. We're waiting for the Banking Committee, which works on transit, to do their piece. We're waiting for the Commerce Committee, which does safety, does rail, some airlines. We're waiting for them to do their piece. And then we're looking for the Finance Committee, on which I serve, to actually figure out how to pay for all this. So what we've tried to do in our committee, Environment and Public Works Committee, is lead by example. My hope is the other. And I'm literally meeting with members, Democrats and Republicans from the other committees, to say, this is what we've done, and it's important that you join us and not just leave us out there, but join the parade.
Okay, Senator, really delight to have you on as always. That's Senator Tom Carper. He's a Democrat from Delaware, joining us from Capitol Hill. Coming up here, we're going to continue on that theme of infrastructure. We talk with American Water CEO Susan Story about them next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. 2020 presidential campaigns are ramping up, and Facebook is looking to take steps to avoid some of the issues that gave it a black eye last time there was an election. Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg spoke with Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde at the Bloomberg Year Ahead Summit earlier today.
We think the 2020 election is a massive test for us. And it should be. You know, elections have changed. We've changed as a company. If you look back to 2016, of course we were prepared for state actors, but what they really did was hack in and take information. This new, more insidious, right, false stuff, we were totally unprepared. We never thought of it. We missed it. Everyone missed it. That's different now. Now we really work hard to find what we think of as coordinated, inauthentic behavior. State actors, groups of people that are trying to do fake stuff. In 2016, we had never heard of this. In 2017, we took down 1. In the last year, we took down 50, 7 in the last 2 weeks alone. So we're in a very different place. We are going after fake accounts. Every single thing that happened from the IRA on Facebook in 2016 was done through a fake account. We are now able to take down millions every day, most before anyone sees them. Misinformation, we didn't have a fact-checking program at all in 2016. Now, if something is marked false by our third-party fact checkers, we can really reduce distribution, and we can show related articles so people see the other side of the story. And some really good independent studies have reported that fake news on Facebook is definitely on the decline. I think the Stanford study said it gone down by more than half since 2016. And transparency.
Yeah.
You know, this is really important. In 2016, you could only see any ad on Facebook targeted at you. When you went to a page, you didn't know who was behind that page. Now, we have an ads library, so you can see anything that anyone is showing anyone in terms of political ads.
People
and I
using
think
that? People
intrigued? They are, definitely. And journalists use it, right? And they punch against it and write stories. We're running red team operations. So we have a red team that's always looking for what will the bad guys try to do next and try to get ahead of it. And so this is a major test for us. Now we're building on, I think, some success. 2018, the midterms, we were very focused. From everything we know sitting today, they went very well. EU parliamentary elections, we've had lots of elections since then, but we know that this is a big one, and this is the highest priority for the next year.
That was Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg speaking earlier today with Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde. Well, the question really is, does Facebook's biggest concern line up with its users? Is it politics or is it privacy? We'll talk about that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Before the break, we heard how Facebook is focusing on avoiding problems with political speech and with advertising. But others are still focused on how it's handling the privacy of those who go online, something the FTC has looked at more than once and fined Facebook for more than $5 billion just last July. Welcome now, Jennifer Rhee. She's Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst for Antitrust Litigation. So, Jennifer, I'm really curious about what the FTC knew and didn't know, because there has been some leaked documents now involving Facebook and privacy that are sort of bad documents. Did the FTC know about those when it imposed its fine?
You know, I'm assuming they did. We don't know, because the FTC is really going to be much quieter about what they're seeing. They're going to maintain the confidentiality of their investigations. But when they fined Facebook $5 billion earlier this year, it was pursuant to a long investigation, and their investigations are thorough. So I have to, and these are the kinds of documents they would have asked for in a civil investigative demand, which is like a subpoena. So I have to assume they probably did see these, and they may have even weighed into this penalty.
At the same time, Facebook has not always been forthcoming in discovery, because now there are reports going out of California where there are state actions pending, where people are complaining, you're not really responding to our document requests very promptly.
Right, so that's an investigation. So the Attorney General of California is seeking the help of the court, basically just to enforce a California state subpoena. And what they're saying is that the response was just simply inadequate or just incomplete. And I think, David, you were a lawyer, you know that these things happen, these skirmishes happen. Big companies do everything they can to protect the privacy of the emails of the executives and others, and so they're going to make arguments that these aren't relevant or they're protected by privilege, and sometimes you have to resort to courts to decide.
And that's a good legal argument.
Yes.
But there are times that you can win the legal argument and lose in the court of public opinion.
Yeah,
and right now,
absolutely.
the notion that Facebook is coming in and saying we got to protect the privacy of our executives, when the question is, have you protected the privacy of those millions and millions of users? It's a hard one from the court of public opinion standpoint.
I agree. I think it's a disconnect. I mean, it's really a disconnect. But, they're lawyers, they're a big company, and I think to the extent there are actions against them on privacy, on antitrust, they're going to fight it tooth and nail. They're going to fight it to the end, and that includes objecting to these broad subpoenas and trying to get them narrowed down. And we also don't know what the argument is on the subpoena. Perhaps those requests are very broad, and Facebook has a good argument.
In the meantime, we don't know what Congress is or is not going to do. We had all those hearings for Congress, and they really haven't taken much action, have they?
Well, Congress has been collecting documents, too. So the thing is, it takes some time. I know people want things to move quickly, and everybody says this is going to be expeditious. But I think Congress has probably seen these documents, too. And above anything else, I think these documents are going to harm Facebook on the antitrust side.
Okay, many thanks to Jennifer Rhee from Bloomberg Intelligence. She's our antitrust guru, we call her. Okay, we're going to switch gears now from social media to infrastructure. Remember all that talk about infrastructure in the early days of the Trump administration? We don't seem to hear much about it anymore. But that doesn't mean that the issue has gone away. American Water Works is the largest, most geographically diverse, publicly traded water utility in the nation. Welcome now its CEO, Susan Story, for today's Conversation in Chief. So welcome back, Susan. We've talked about this issue before.
Yes, David.
And I just I just saw somebody sent me something as American Society of Civil Engineers rates overall our infrastructure, overall, not just water, but infrastructure, at a D+. Are we making any progress?
We are making progress, but not quickly enough. Most of the investment, especially in water and wastewater, took place in the 1940s and 50s following World War II. So it's coming end of life, and a lot of cities and municipalities simply don't have the money to invest in their infrastructure. They're busy funding pensions, and they're busy with firefighters, police officers, building schools, all the important things that cities have to do.
So tell us how your company fits into that, because you largely, I think, are state-controlled utilities, and you just deliver water and you take care of wastewater. Do you build the infrastructure, or does the city or the state build the infrastructure?
So our business model is we are a regulated utility, similar to electrics and gas. We are regulated by state public service commissions. We invest the money ourselves. We have excellent access to capital markets. American Water's S&P A credit rated. This year alone, we will invest about $1.7 billion just in infrastructure in our service area of water and wastewater. And then when you look at the municipal systems that we're buying because they're distressed, we're buying 19. That's another $200 million we're projecting just this year.
So you have access to the capital markets. You put the money in, but you have to get the money back. You have to get a return on your investment. Are the regulators open to you passing along some of the costs to the rate holder, the ratepayers?
They are, David, because water is a critical human need. So in terms of water supply, and we've seen states where that's been an issue, water quality, the issue of emerging contaminants, no one wants to be the next city that has had problems with their water quality, and water infrastructure is very key. So we're investing. We also are seeing an increased need for resiliency investment. What I mean by that, in the Northeast, as you know, the past 10 to 12 years, we've had 6 100-year floods. We're building our systems now to 500-year floodplain specifications. So we've got to get this right before we are faced with flooding or hurricanes or ice storms.
We're talking with Susan Story. She's the CEO of American Water Works. You mentioned about contaminants in water. We obviously have the Flint story. My hometown actually is Flint, Michigan, but also Newark we've had, and various other places. How bad a problem is that?
So interestingly, there are 144 million chemicals registered globally, and every 2.5 seconds they're breaking down into substances, some of which we don't know what they are. We can't regulate all of those. The EPA regulates 100. We must have more and more research into how do we deal with these contaminants. At our company, we have an R&D group with 15 scientists. We're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to start doing predictive profiles of chemicals and biologics so that we can stop any type of contamination event before it ever happens.
So we may not be catching up the way we should on the infrastructure investment, but your company specifically has been doing pretty well financially. You're doing all right. How much of that is because of an increased awareness of environmental, social, governance issues, the so-called ESG?
That is a great point. Actually, even though we're a U.S. company, around 28% of our stock is owned by international investors. This year alone, I've done 4 international investor trips by demand. Typically, I do 1 or 2, and it's because these ESG principles are so strong, and to have a regulated utility that has a highly sustainable image and scores very highly in ESG, there's a lot of demand from an investor standpoint for that.
So you know this area so terribly well, unlike most of the rest of us. What needs to be done, and who needs to do it to really have us catch up to where we need to be in infrastructure? Is it federal? Is it state? Is it local? Is it private enterprise? How do we get there?
It's all of the above, David. Water and sanitation services are so critical. One particular group can't make these solutions. So we're working with federal agencies, we're working with state governments, we're working with local municipalities. We share a lot of our research. We're partnering with EPA and Centers for Disease Control to say, here are the key issues. PFAS, for example, there's not just lead, a lot of press about PFAS, the chemicals that once they get into the body can't get rid of them. So we need to find solutions and treatment that then everyone can utilize.
So give us a sense of how concentrated your business is. As I say, you're the largest, most geographically diverse. How big is the second largest? Is this a few large players nationally, or are there a lot of smaller companies?
Investor-owned water utilities, there are only 8. Investor-owned, we are half the whole market size of the entire 8. The next largest water utility is a little less than 2 times or a little more than 2 times our size, and the rest are $3 to $4 billion market cap and below.
You said investor-owned. So if you take the whole marketplace, investor-owned and publicly owned, What percentage are investor owned?
So investor owned are about 15% of water and 2% of wastewater. Municipals run 84% of water and they run 98% of wastewater at this point.
To what extent is regulation helping or hurting you? Because we know that there's a clean water case that was just argued yesterday in the Supreme Court, and the Trump administration wants to dial back on some of the regulation. Is that helpful to you from your point of view?
We are advocates for strong water quality standards. And what we have found with the Environmental Protection Agency is there's a lot of support for us to keep those water standards up in terms of drinking water.
Fascinating. What's your biggest challenge?
Biggest challenge always is making sure that there's not a contamination of it and that we are at the forefront of cyber protection.
It's great to have you here, Susan.
Thank you,
Always is good to have you here. That is Susan Story. She is the president of American Water Company, and she's going to continue this on the second hour of Balance of Power. We're going to be over on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Besides Susan Story, we're also going to have the CEO of CVS, who had their earnings out and did rather well this week. That's coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power. It's on Bloomberg Television and Radio, live from New York.